My name is Narasimhan. On behalf of the Water Resources Center Archives and the California Water Colloquium, it is my great pleasure to welcome you for this last colloquium for this semester and for this academic year. And before I introduce today's speaker, I want to start with a small story. My own introduction to California's water has been only over the past 7 or 8 years or so. Before that, I used to do a lot of number crunching and mathematics and all kinds of so-called fancy, sophisticated things with the computers dealing with water, but I knew very little about California. And I was talking to a colleague from the US Geological Survey, and I had just read about the disappearance or the environmental damage to Aral Sea in Russia. So I just, in a very condescending way, I said, see what the Russians had done to Aral Sea. And then he told me, do you know about Tulare Lake? I said, what Tulare Lake? And then he told me about a book titled The Vanishing Landscape. It had been written by somebody who had grown up as a young person in the Tulare area, had learned about what happened to the Tulare Lake, and then went on to study the lake and its history and the human impacts of the lake, and then went on to do a PhD. And so that person happens to be today's speaker, Professor William Preston, who teaches in the Department of Social Science in Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. And after his undergraduate education at Cal State Fresno, he went his life's passion of studying Tulare Lake to the University of Oregon, where he did a PhD on the Tulare Lake, its existence and its disappearance. He has been teaching at Cal Poly since 1980. He teaches in the true spirit of geography, in the sense that he teaches both the physical geography as well as the human geography. And together, they really give the soul or the personality, the field of geography. So here today he is going to talk about not only about where he grew up, but also about the science of human impacts on nature. Bill Preston.
Thank you. At the tea a little while ago, somebody asked me why I was interested in the San Joaquin Valley. And well, one, I grew up there, but another, I was always interested in, I'd be careful in this room, the old timers that used to share in Tulare what they used to remember and what their parents told them and what they used to see. And not being very cerebral, as I'll demonstrate, I used to like to go out and see if I could find the legacies or the vestiges of the landscapes they were talking about. And I couldn't find it. The valley has that ephemeral type character to it. You know, we have thousands of years of cultural humus is just erased. So much that I couldn't see. And so I tried to envision it, and I didn't know anything about geography at that time, but as somebody in high school, I decided to go into engineering. So after 2 years, but somehow I couldn't articulate it, but it wasn't quite fulfilling my needs that I couldn't articulate at all. And then I went into history, and back when I was at Fresno State, history seemed to have been taught as kind of where the environment is a neutral stage upon which the human drama unfolds. And I think it was one of my first and few innovative thoughts. I said the environment must play a role. In other words, there must be kind of a dynamic dual relationship between the environment and the evolution of human cultures. And one thing led to another, and I had a great advisor at the University of Oregon and said, since you're not going to get any grant money anyway, why don't you go live at home and do your PhD research? Not living at home is not advisable, but it was cheap. But the idea, of course, was among my colleagues, I was kind of backwater because they were going off to places like Brazil, my graduate school colleagues, and Switzerland, and coming back with these exotic stories. And I come back telling them about stories like Corcoran and Tipton and Tulare. But I'm glad I did so, and I really appreciate being invited to come here because it's kind of rekindled an old interest. I've sort of slanted away from the study of the Tulare Lake Basin and Tulare Lake until recently, and I really appreciate and I'm honored to be invited to this symposium. I'm sure many of you have had this experience where a glance at the southern San Joaquin Valley, you'll see an area often identified as Tulare Lake Bed or Tulare Lake Dry. And sometimes, depending on when the map was drafted, you'll even see in this vicinity, right, this is just to the west of the 99, to the east of I-5 down in the vicinity, and I'll point this out when we talk, Fresno and that other cultural hearth called Bakersfield is in this vicinity for those that are not initiated to this area, but sometimes you'll see a little squarish, peculiar body of water there too, which is a holding pond. And at the cusp of this century, 21st century, visitors and locals alike just kind of view this as subtle anomalies, easier to see and experience on a map than you do on the ground. There's not much to see. And this undistinguished setting, of course, is a recent phenomenon. Because for thousands of years, this setting had nurtured an uncommon assemblage of biotic or biological richness, and also served as the cradle of life for untold numbers of people. And yet, it's hard to see that today when you drive across that landscape and see so few homesteads. And what I'd like to do today is kind of show you that just because the aquatic expression of Tulare Lake is no longer there most of the time, this is not a requiem for the lake at all. This is not the final chapter in the environmental history of Tulare Lake and its watershed. In fact, what we're experiencing today in the long term is not out of character for Tulare Lake. This is only a momentary period, because Tulare Lake will reemerge. Tulare Lake will reemerge, and fairly recently, fairly soon, will throw off its human constraints and will challenge culture once again to restructure itself and also to accommodate it. Well, with that in mind, what I'd like to share with you today is a story, and what it is going to be a history of the lake and its interactions with biology. I'm going to restrict it to the interactions of life to the lake's peculiar hydrology as kind of a guiding construct in this, with particular emphasis upon post-Columbian human adaptation. And these adaptations, of course, to this ephemeral lake has created landscapes that are equally ephemeral. To begin, I'd like to look at the physical setting. Just I yanked this right out of my PhD thesis, just to let some of you that don't know this area very well, of course, the Tulare Lake Basin is mainly politically the valley portions of Kings and Tulare counties. It's at about the latitude of 35 to 36 degrees north latitude. Kind of important. This idea of position is going to have bearing on some of the things I'm going to be saying later on. And of course, what happens here is that a long period of geological, hydrological, and climatic processes culminated in a depression, a low, shallow depression, which contains the inflow from a number of rivers. It's an area of internal drainage most of the time. A little bit about its position, of course, is between the Coast Range in the west and the Sierra Nevadas in the east. The rainfall is scant. It lies in the rain shadow of the Coast Range. Today, I'm talking about the last 100 years, the rainfall near Kettleman City, about 4 inches. And of course, the rainfall increases as you go eastward until you get over to the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, and it reaches 10 to 12 inches of rainfall. Very importantly is the amount of solar insolation this place receives. It's only surpassed this area and the area further south in Kern County. It's only surpassed in terms of yearly insolation by the Mojave Desert. And of course, this amount of energy striking this is going to be part of the story of life, especially. And also it's going to have impacts on the lake's hydrology as well. This is a contour map showing, and of course the lake is to the west, or sits on top of the axis of the San Joaquin Valley, which sits to the west of center. Today, the lowest place in the lake bed is about 179, 180 feet, contour line. Now importantly, Tulare Lake, which obviously is not there, is only what we call Tulare Lake is just a version of lakes that have been in this part of the San Joaquin Valley for hundreds of thousands of years. If I intercepted about 600,000 years ago, that was at the end of a huge period, or a huge lake, which we call Lake Corcoran. Some of you have heard of that occupied the whole San Joaquin Valley, and it was in that environment, this great inland sea, for tens of thousands of years. But about 600,000 years ago, Lake Corcoran drained. Well, from that period on, we had sequences of small lakes and marshes and trunk streams going through the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley. There was about 4 episodes of large lakes since about 600,000 years ago, and only 2 episodes of when we had the ancestors to Tulare Lake, 2 episodes in the last 130,000 years where we had water that was equivalent to the historical period, only 2 episodes. What seems to govern, of course, Tulare Lake, the climate, no doubt, the topography, no doubt, but what sort of determines throughout time, and even in the recent, is depositional. It's 2 alluvial fans that coalesce just north of the lake today. The alluvial fan, or deposition, by the Kings River coming out of the Sierra Nevada, and to lesser extent the Los Gatos Creek that we call it today, coming out of the Coast Range. Studies have determined, at least to my satisfaction, that the size of the lake is more determined by this what's so-called fan dam to the north of the lake, the lip, than the climate or other aspects. And of course, that fan dam has been there periodically, going back hundreds of thousands of years, but the fan dam would be lowered due to a number of things, including differential subsidence, incision by rivers, and also, of course, the infilling of the lake itself would raise the level of the lake, spill it over, and help erode that fan dam. The presence of the lake over the last several 100,000 years seems to be tightly linked with glaciation in the Sierra Nevada. Now, there's been several episodes, but the glaciation in the Sierra Nevada, it appears that during glacial advances, these fan dams will build, and then they slow their building until we have the glacial retreats. Now, the last one began about 25,000 years ago with glacial advance in the Sierra Nevada to the east. And the dam grew quite rapidly with all the sediment and glacial outwash being taken across this Kings River. And we had a lake developing at that time, and then we had another surge of building the fan dam at the end of that glacial period, about 11 to 13,000 years ago. And it appears that this last dam stopped being formed about 10,000 years ago, and since about 10,000 years ago, it's lowered somewhat through, again, subsidence, incision, and some other processes. This is a depiction trying to show what may have gone on. Again, 26,000 years ago, this is called the Tioga glacial advance in the Sierra Nevada, with considerable outwash, north to your left, of course south to your right, the incipient dam nearing completion about 15,000 years ago, completed about 10,000 years ago, and now we still have that relic dam that's there. Now again, I don't want to mislead you. The evidence does support that if we look over the last 600,000 years, for most of the time we did not have a lake equivalent to Tulare Lake where we have it. Only 2 episodes where it was as large as we see during the historical period. It was very wet in this vicinity, and climate did oscillate, and the evidence supports that at times there were small intermittent lakes in this area. There were marshes and lakes, and at other times just a trunk stream without lakes at all. Well, owing to the shallowness and owing to this arid climate, and also to the wide fluctuation of inflow in the particular climate we have, Tulare Lake fluctuated very, very dramatically, both on a year-to-year basis, but also on a weekly basis. And what I'm going to show you is based on the only archival record that we have, which has been deemed to have been gathered prior to any kind of significant alterations in the lake. And it only lasts 22 years, from about the year 1850 to the year 1872. In other words, there were people that were chronicling this, talking about it, writing about it. And for that 22-year period, it was watched. And we might get an inkling, although I think I must give a cautionary statement. This may not be reflective of most of the past, but it kind of gives you an idea, at least, that the waxing and waning capabilities of this lake that is very important in terms of cultural adaptation to it. And I'd like to show you in a very retro-tech way, very primitive way, how shallow this basin is. Again, just to give you an idea of scale, between these fingers, it's about 30 miles, and that's about 20 miles. But if we have 1 foot of water in the lake, just 1 foot deep, it'll cover 55 miles, 55 square miles, just with 1 foot of water. If you add to that, if you just put 7 feet deep in this lake, you'll increase the lake to 200 square miles. Add a few more feet, and I promise not to do this forever, but if you increase the elevation of the lake to 12 feet deep, and that's in the deepest part. The average depth is going to be much less. 12 feet deep, it goes to 300 square miles. And although I promise not to do it forever, if we add another 8 feet, now you get the picture. You have almost 500 square miles. It doesn't take very much to cause it. And then if you add a grand total of 32 feet from the base, 37 feet from the lowest point, you have water 37 feet deep, not much more than from here to the wall. You'll cover over 750 square miles. Tremendous. Now again, if you remember, spring runoff, and also consider the evaporation potential of the sun. The sun will evaporate from a standing body of water in this environment over 4 feet. And if you evaporate 4 feet from this lake in a season, and everything being equal and not increasing any more inflow to the lake, the shoreline on the eastern shore will back up 4 miles. 4 miles, just evaporate 1 foot. If the lake goes down 1 foot, it's a mile. 2 feet, 2 miles. Now, of course, this doesn't happen throughout the lake. The western boundary is a little more steep, but out here, it drops about a foot a mile. Another aspect of this lake which proves very important in terms of the association of life or the assemblage of life that co-evolved with it is that the winds, prevailing winds, are mainly out of the northwest, and the lake, depending on the strength of the winds, can be pushed up to 2 miles on those very, very low shorelines. At times they've recorded mainly on the average during really windy weather, the lake would, especially in the east and also the southeast, the lake would encroach over a mile. And on really, really strong storms, they would encroach almost 2 miles. And of course, in turn, it would leave a great deal of marshy territory in the areas back up in this environment. And people have exploited, well, they had to, people have had to run from this side, but they often ran to the other side to pick up the clams and the mussels and many other aquatic creatures they saw as a resource. Another aspect of the hydrology which proves important in terms of especially human adaptation is that until the lake gets up to about the 212 contour, there's islands in the southern portion of the lake, these ephemeral islands, and if the lake gets above 212 feet, they will disappear. What happens in this lake is, in order for the lake to overflow into the San Joaquin River to the north, according to historical archives, the lake has to get up to about the 210 contour line, which would be it's 32 feet deep at its deepest point, against much shallower on average. At that point, when it overflows into the San Joaquin, 210 feet contour, it's about 615 square miles. However, during that archival period, the maximum overflow it went up to the contour line of 217 feet, and the lake was about 37 feet deep, and it covered well over 750 square miles when it did this. During that archival period, the lake overflowed just about a quarter of the time, and 3/4 of that 22 years, it did not overflow, and it hovered around the 200-foot contour. Now, of course, this kind of peculiar hydrology, given its position, given its climate, given its topography, has produced an uncommon set of biota. And it's difficult to reconstruct what was there, but the evidence suggests, of course, that if we focus upon the lake shores, a tremendous variety of vegetation along the shores that had to cope and co-evolve with a waxing and waning of those shores, as I've illustrated, seasonally associated to wet and dry cycles, almost on a weekly basis, and different associations of vegetation, desert saltbush, spiny saltbush, lowland heath, tules and bulrushes, and many other different forms. Very importantly, too, are the fauna, or the animals that had adapted to this environment as well. The lake was a virtual aquarium, as shallow lakes tend to be, with the sunlight able to penetrate to the base of the lake at all times. Tremendous rich ecosystem. In the lake itself, clams, terrapin, mussels, fish of various varieties, sculpin, dace, Sacramento squawfish. We know sturgeon made it in there. It's still being debated as to whether there were trout in the lake because it was warmer and a tad alkaline. But the old-timers claim that not only were there trout coming down the streams like the Tule and the Kauai and the Kings River, which is the main feeder to this lake, that during periods of overflow, if it coincided with the runs of steelhead and salmon on the San Joaquin River, that some of them came into the lake as well. Again, the archaeology is not verifying this. In my book, I mentioned this. I just bought it. You know, I bought it. There was steelhead and various other forms, and owing to the archaeology that's been done in the last 10 or 15 years, I'm beginning to change my mind a little bit about that, but it certainly was possible. And in the lake itself, it's hard to believe when you drive to Corcoran or Hanford or Lemoore, but you're in the habitat of mink, beaver. There were otters. And of course, every kind of waterfowl that you can think of. This is right underneath the western flyway. At all times, there were some waterfowl feeding, breeding, or nesting in this environment. Along the shore, elk, antelope, at times deer, rabbits. It goes on and on. And of course, human beings found this lake very, very attractive. Human beings have been associated with this lake for over 10,000 years. And, you know, the ones that were encountered by the Euro-Americans, we have called them the Yokuts. And they came to this region because of its resources, you know, nutritive and shelter resources, but they found it very, very rich. And virtually a Thule culture. Frank Latta from Bakersfield, I believe, said it best when he described the Lake Yokuts: strictly a goose, duck, mud hen, swan, blue heron, a egret, pelican, lake, slough, swamp and overflow culture. Water and mosquitoes everywhere, waterfowl and fish in myriads, more tules, and mosquitoes. Well, of course, this lake did provide a lot of advantages for the local Yokuts. It was home. It was the center of their economic existence and their spiritual existence. There were some advantages that this lake held due to its hydrology. Of course, a fishery, and of course, long, wide, shallow shorelines, tremendous miles and miles deep of bulrushes and tules, shells, clams, and mussels, utilizing these resources. The elk and the antelope using them, the waterfowl. That's why we sometimes call the Yokuts the fowlers in this environment. Tremendous resource, lots of advantages in that way. The demography of the Yokuts seem to reflect that. Very dense populations along that lake, as dense as found anywhere in California, with the exception of maybe the Chumash and some of the coastal enclaves. But of course, the lake also provided some constraints. Mosquitoes, I've got to add that. You know, was a problem to adapt to. And also wet and dry cycles. Although the lake somewhat compensated for that, because when the lake shrank during drought periods, it often concentrated the remaining wildlife in the lake, the fish. When the lake expanded, it just expanded the area that could be harvested. However, that shifting shoreline was very, very difficult to cope with. And the Yokuts had a very mobile, especially on the eastern and southern shore, very mobile society, because when the wind would blow, they'd literally, we have evidence that they would pack up and leave because the lake would encroach upon some of their habitats. And even though the Yokuts had their own landscape, of course, settlements and trails, and also they did change this environment. You know, they did not just rely upon the vagaries of nature. They burned the tules. They brought many animals to local depletion, not to extinction, but they depleted them in this environment. But they had lots of land use practices, which was part of that landscape. But thousands of years of this kind of inhabiting this region is so ephemeral because it's going to be wiped out very, very quickly. And of course, what does this, and is going to have an impact upon the not only the Yokuts, but the environment that nurtured them. Thank you. Well, I call it the disassembly, phase 1, human and fur extractors. This may annoy you, but I put the year 1500 there as the beginning of this. All of you California researchers know that the first mission in California was 1769. But I think the evidence supports that the exotic germs preceded the first missionaries, swept into this area, affected the Yokuts, obviously, wave after wave of epidemics. And one of the effects was a rebound once the yokuts were depopulated. The predation on many of the animals decreased, and there was a rebound in the wildlife. And when it was first encountered by the Spanish and the American and Euro-American fur trappers, they thought it was really a paradise. But I would argue that it wasn't like that with the yokuts. The animals were there, but not in that abundance. In other words, you remove the chief predator, and there was that rebound. Well, these newcomers came to the lake for resources too, but a different set of resources. The human resources in terms of the Spanish and the Mexican period. During the Spanish period, taking yokuts back to the missions to repopulate the mission environments with indigenous peoples. Interestingly, that was after 1769, and of course they introduced more germs. But the lake also served as a refuge. It was one of the chief places that the Spanish did harvest human beings from, but it also acted as a refuge because it was difficult for the Spanish and the Mexicans to go after the yokuts. It took refuge in the tules, miles into the lake. And we're going to see that the lake, it does focus people's attention, but it remains a refugium for so many things, not only lifeways, but for animals. The fur trappers, of course, come in for mainly American fur trappers beginning in the 1820s, coming in for the beaver, the otter, and the mink. Well, the consequences of this was depletion. One of the greatest depletions, of course, were the yokuts, which was part of nature. Not only the yokuts themselves, but also their land use practices that had enhanced some of the biological fecundity in this region. The depletion of the mink, the otter, and the beaver by 1850. However, the waters themselves remain unconstrained. In other words, the hydrology remained unconstrained. Introductions, feral livestock began to affect the shoreline, cows and horses as early as 1830s and before. Also the introductions of exotic species of vegetation, like oats and fillory and many others, began to mingle and in some case increase the biotic diversity of this environment. But overall, most environments were depleted. The next phase, I call it disassembly, phase 2, the lake miners. Again, we see that the cultural sequence involving the lake is kind of retarded compared to changes in land use practices elsewhere in the greater watershed. And we see an extension of the Western pioneer, the extension of some of the first pursuits like mining. It's not exactly mining, but I call it mining in the sense that this next group from 1850s to 1880s, they came in to harvest the fish, to mine the waters of the fish, to mine the shorelines of the game, and also to mine the shorelines in terms of the forage for herding. Hunters came in, of course, and hunted the elk and the antelope. There were many advantages to the hydrology because it was the largest hunting blind on Earth. And they also hunted for the waterfowl. And when the railroad came into this vicinity in the 1870s, it was a chief source of feathers and fat and meat for San Francisco, and also the elk and the antelope. The fishermen came in, and by the 1870s and 1880s, tremendous hauls of fish were being taken out. In fact, the lake offered an advantage. You would take the nets, the great seines, out with boats, and you'd have horse teams, then drop the nets, the seines, and then have horses pull them back towards shore. In the 1880s, the average haul was between 500 and 1,500 pounds in each seine. At least the evidence supports. In 1888, between September and November of 1888, two towns nearby, Lemoore and Hanford, sent out total for those months 134,000 pounds of aquatic species. I say that because they took everything that's in it to San Francisco. During this period, it's a lot of information here, but the lake remained pretty high, especially 1850s, 1860s, into the 1870s. And most people at this time thought the lake was going to be permanent. It was an interesting curiosity. It served as a refuge for some of the land use practices that first came into the West, like grazing, and in this case hunting, as well as fishing. The surrounding watershed, of course, went through a fairly rapid progression, as we find in the West, first herding, and then dry land grain, and then more intensive irrigated agriculture, but not around the lake. During this period that I call the lake miners, there were some visionaries that thought that maybe the soils underneath the lake might be worthwhile after all. See, in the 1850s, 1860s, and early 1870s, this was an immediate backwater. One, the soils were considered around the lake and underneath the lake as infertile. It was treeless, so it wasn't fertile. Number two, you didn't have running water around the lake, so that constrained settlement. Number three, the lake was considered unhealthy through these decades. As one person said, the lake is full of foul and pestilent vapors, congregation of vapors. They thought that this gaseous matter somehow led to malaria and other ailments. So there are a lot of things working against the lake, but there were a few visionaries that thought that we would have an opportunity to exploit the lake itself. Three different things were suggested, and some was government supported. One was to drain the lakes entirely and use the soil. Another was to take the San Joaquin River and drain it into Tulare Lake and expand the size of Tulare Lake and use it for irrigation for the northern part of the valley. Another was just to leave the lake and create canals for the freight, hauling freight. But none of those came to fruition. I would like to remind you that the relationship to the lake during this period of lake miners was not as intimate as the Yokuts, but the information that these people had, it did grow. And since the lake was was fairly uniform in its depths, in other words, it never did go dry and it hovered around the 200-foot contour, people learned about the lake. Those that lived beside it, and they called themselves lakelanders, they learned about the lake and they labeled those lakes, and people there as well as in the watershed knew about these places. And it was a landscape. It was there long enough to have its own landings. There were 5 landings and trails and other features that are quickly going to be destroyed. The next period, expulsion, phase 1, lakelanders and colonists. By the 1870s, even though lake mining continued, the last lake miners, late 1800s, late 1880s and early 1890s, by the 1870s, because of diversion of irrigation water from the rivers like Kauai and the Kings River and elsewhere, the lake began to shrink. And this is coupled with some very, very dry periods. And some people began to experiment in the 1870s with the lake shores for growing grain. And the reason was not an experimentation there, but elsewhere in the watershed, higher up, it was discovered that those treeless plains do have rich soils. And it was the great grain era in the San Joaquin Valley in general, and some of these grain farmers began to try the lake itself, and they became known as sandlappers. And what's going to happen is that the sandlappers are going to bet on the lake's natural fluctuation, and they're going to open the gates for another group of people that's going to bet on their ability to control those waters. The sandlappers would come in the fall as the lake was drying up, as it does every year, plant their grain, and then try to come back in the spring when it matured prior to the time that the lake rose and covered it. They would literally harvest the grain prior to the rising of the waters. They experimented with using the waters for irrigation, but found the water was too alkaline for that. and also the shifting lake shores made this very, very difficult to do. Finally, by the 1880s, owing to the continual diversion of irrigation water, and climate continued to fluctuate, it never did dry. The first time it dried since 1850 that we know of was in 1897. But beginning in the 1870s, again, because of diversion of the water, it began to shrink, and people finally decided that we're going to have to get rid of it. And we can develop the lakes for its agricultural potential. And beginning in the 1880s, some reclamation work commenced. This is a map. The lake was derived from the late 1800s, but you already see some of the reclamation changing the natural contours of the shoreline. And it's also at this time that we see a great change in the perception of the lake. A lot of people had been curious about it and talked about the lake as a permanent feature in decades prior to this, but now the lake became an impediment to progress. Quotes from the 1800s. "The lake is nothing more than a catch basin whose water is valueless." Another quote, "Never much more than a shallow morass." Another piece of boosterism for the valley that was disseminated across the United States to try to get settlers to come. "The one natural feature of the county that our conscience will not let us praise." And of course, the idea was we were setting the scene to get rid of it. It was in the way. Finally, the piecemeal attempt based on individual growers to try to harness this lake, they found that that was not possible. By the 1890s, people began to realize that the reclamation is going to occur on a cooperative basis. And the monopolists and the larger growers really benefited the most from this because they had the capital to work at, and they also had the influence and the clout to work the government. In other words, to help petition for reclamation laws that would help stimulate the recovery of this lake and also grant rewards. This just shows a map of selections for, in terms of land alienation, the transfer of land from government land to private. And the areas in black here just show individuals that selected entire blocks, in other words, entire sections, when they bought it or accumulated it from different using different land acts. Now, this process, which I'll try to flesh out a little bit with these slides, 1880s, 1890s, very, very important, because this is when you have biotic cleansing. The shoreline overstocked. The end of the lake miners came about 1880s and 1890s, the fishing, the herding, the hunting because of overexploitation. Also some droughts assisted in this process. The lake became more saline. The fishing was reduced considerably. Overhunting of the bird life. The last great flock was in 1903. Some introductions, more diseases, more exotic plants. There were some attempts to try some new species of fish, carp, whitefish, black bass, and catfish were introduced, and they quickly died because of salinity. Some of them lasted longer than some of the native species. But these kinds of things were at work. But when we start attacking the lake, we're attacking it's an assault on the lake waters. We're attacking the linchpin of the entire system, the whole biotic system. And this idea of indirect attack by diverting the waters and direct attack by reclamation was highly successful. And it was also helped out by periodic droughts that were not seen in the earlier part of the 19th century. The reclamation was complete just in a decade or so. It was helped out by the great droughts that were occurring. In other words, pure dry periods that were unique. They did not occur earlier. The first time the lake dried up, 1897. Between 1897 and 1940, the lake was dry for 19 years. Nothing like that ever, not one dry year before 1897. Now, that's not all climate, because you have to factor into this the diversion of the water. And by 1905, the whole lake bed began to show the geometry of ownership and the geometry of control at the expense of the geography of nature. The lake bed was divided up into water districts and storage districts, and multiple different kinds of districts that would control the water. However, it still was not a guaranteed environment, because like a phantom, the lake often came back. And it was usually only the large growers, the ones with capital, that could withstand the blows I'm going to talk to you about. In 1905, they planted 60,000 acres in grain on land that never had seen grain before. But in 1906, that happened. Now, of course, what this kind of process did was it winnowed out the people that couldn't afford to recover. What it did was culled those that could not handle it, the smaller landholder. And indeed, to bring this into production, it did take the energy, the cleverness, it took labor too, but also the capital of the larger growers. 1923, totally dry again. In fact, it started a 14-year period of drought, the largest we know of, except going back to what you heard from Scott Stein, when you had the mother of all droughts back in the medieval anomaly. But 14 years, and it was turned into grainland. And this was a period, of course, when we had a change economically. Not only did this overlap with the Depression, but it overlapped with the great droughts in the West in the 1930s. But what we have was fluctuating prices, farm prices. It began before the Depression, the 1920s, and only the larger growers survived these. More expensive water, and most of this is dry land grain at this time. Also labor unrest, social unrest in this environment, and higher land taxes. And again, some of the smaller settlers, the lakelanders that had come out, lost their presence, and this area was turned into what I call the Imperial geometry. In the 1940s, the growers, in order to survive, decided they needed irrigation water. They had learned some lessons out here in this very transient environment in terms of the waxing and waning of the lake and also climate. First, well water. Second, petitioning the government to bring in canal water, to try to build dams on the Kern River and also the Kings River to ensure that. More control. In the beginning of the 1940s, convincing the Army Corps of Engineers to come in and help build levees. They learned through trial and error in the earlier years, no matter how well they tried to organize the levee system, they needed bigger levees and more input. And they were able to succeed in this from 1940 to today. The overwhelming number of the years have been dry. And the lake, when it is wet, never gets above about the 190-foot contour when we do have inordinate floods. 1945, when we had wet years, notice the lake now is appearing geometric. Of course, this is, and they would often, the water districts would often compete with one another. It was a cooperative venture, but between water districts, sometimes you want to save your crop by flooding another person's water district. This happened quite a bit. A lot of lawsuits commenced from this. Great stories about innovative techniques of trying to harvest the grain literally a few feet in front of the rising water by putting mud shoes on horses, pulling the harvest machines. It's quite interesting. It's a study in itself. But of course, the Imperial geography, this is just an agglomeration of water districts, irrigation districts, and water storage districts. I just had some fun with this, just showing that, of course, during the wet years, it just depends on the political relationships between these districts on who's going to get wet first. The water is going to have to be absorbed, and you see this change from more natural contours in the 1800s to some real variety of shapes. And of course, we've had periodic floods. 1969, 80,000, 90,000 acres flooded. Notice the framework of the geography of floods. And you'd think you might just repeat that in the next flood, but again, it's power relationships. By the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, most of the land was being irrigated by both surface and well water. Here's another episode, 1983, where approximately the same amount of land was flooded, but a different expression, aquatic expression. 1997, it happened again. And of course, most of this period was, though this is more natural, no lake whatsoever. You know, the lake bed is exactly what it has become. It's become a grid of agribusiness. This is the largest agribusiness chessboard on earth. Extremely productive. It began with grain, but the diversity of crops out in this region quite impressive. It's not without its problems, and I'll illustrate this with some slides. This is an area of internal drainage, so salinization is a problem. Land subsidence is another problem. Air pollution is a problem, and there's a social problem here too. We have some of the richest land on the face of the earth and some of the poorest communities around it. Some statistics and indices in places like Alpa, Huron, Kettleman City, and some of the other locales, kind of elicit statistics that seem more like a third world environment than a first world environment. What does the future hold? There's some exciting prospects. When I go out there, I'm saddened, but my life is not directly affected by it. I'm not a grower. I'm not somebody that's a laborer on that land. I'm not reaping the direct benefits from that. And I know what I say is the antithesis of many people's view. I am not directly affected by it. I do like to see the lake come back from time to time. I do think of what was there and what is not there today. You know, when I give you a list of the introductions in terms of species and land use practices and exotic vegetation, there's no sense doing it now. When you reclaim the lake, it's gone. You know, the aquatic underpinnings of that life was gone. It was sterilized. But the lake still does govern, does influence the landscape, and will continue to do so. The lake will come back one of two ways. Probably both, I should say. Greenhouse warming will bring the lake back. Number two, there's an exciting prospect because one particular grower wants you, with your tax money, to buy some of it back. It's Westlake's Farms. It's an exciting adventure, despite the motivations that has occurred here. Westlake Farms has spent a lot of money taking two sections of land over the last couple of decades and turning it back to a wetland. It's fairly impressive. I'll show you what they've done. That illustrates it can be done, and what they want to do is hand it over to the auspices of several government, both state and federal governments. And for this purpose, and they've done the study and they've suggested a couple of courses that can be taken. 15,000 acres on the extreme western edge of the lake, which in olden times, the lake at about the 190-foot contour would be right in this area. If you ever drive to Lemoore, for God knows what reason, you go right by that area. It's very, very close to Kettleman City. Their two options were this. Take that 15,000 acres, return it to an historical state, 1850s, 1860s, with a shoreline, with a lake, levee it off so you can have certain environments for lowland heath, valley salt bush, things like this. The other option would be to go prehistorically and try to shove every environment that we know of into it. I'll show this one up close. What they mean is, instead of just having kind of a uniform water with marsh lands as well, with a few biotic or vegetative environments, try to include them all. And it is kind of exciting. It's very, very ambitious, but you know, almost everything we saw in the valley have little segments. And what they want to do is sort of sell this, and they're going to sell some water rights as well. The negotiations are not completed yet, but it's exciting, at least from my vantage point, because when you visit those two sections of land, it does hark back to some of the writings and some of those people that I used to sit and listen to on their porches, talking about what the lake used to be like. You know, either themselves have seen it or what their parents had told them. It's difficult to fight that presumption that what we do with water and land in the basin today is better than it used to be. But I like to ask the question. It's easier to argue for that when you've wiped out most of the vestiges of the lake, to argue that what we're doing with it today is better. Is it? You know, gone are the tules, gone are the bullfrogs, the mink, the otter. Gone are the waterfowl for the most part. Gone are the fish. And that's up to you to weigh that. I think we ought to prepare, though, the lake's coming back. I have no doubt, just in my study of it, my analysis of it, and what I see on the horizon with some greenhouse warming, whether human-induced or not, is the lake's coming back. Do we want to jump on opportunities like this to try to set up the context, the petri dish for the return of the lake waters, or do we have this uniform puddle? I went over. I'd like to turn on the slides and just quickly run through them, please. I just turned it off.
Yeah, it's okay. Just hit it.
All right.
Hit them both again.
It's on now. These slides have no relevancy whatsoever. I just like these old drawings, that some of the first drawings of the Tulare Lake Basin. This is the first map that I know of drawn by the Spanish, early 1800s, 1815. Just looking from the Coast Range (1840s), explorer Fremont, Derby coming through in the 1850s, different representations. Just showed this one, 1860s, some of the islands showing up in the south. By the way, during the herding period, they used to use pigs a lot, because the pigs would, they loved the tules and the bulrushes and the clams, and they began tasting like them. And they'd use these islands as natural pens. And of course, the pigs later on went feral, and then they became objects of hunt. This is from the late 1970s. Of course, the lake bed, it's still there. You know, there's no water there, but the lake's influence on the contemporary landscape is still there. Land use patterns, you can see, very large compared to other areas: Kings River, Coeophan, White, Deer Creek, Kern. This is a cheap shot. Just flew over and took a picture of some fields. What you're going to notice is very few homesteads in this region. The inevitable ego shot, safflower, cotton. I show these not so much because of the products, but more for the enormity of the operations out here, the investment and the productivity, extremely productive. Sometimes it's not as attractive during periods when the crops, the fields are being prepared. It depends on, these are large operations obviously, depends on machines, depends on water, depends on subsidies, depends on the cleverness and the business abilities of the growers that are working here, and the labor that's available as well. Water is the key. Control of that water, but it's always a threat as well in this area of internal drainage. One of the levees. Sometimes they're not very successful. This is the flood of 1968, 1969. The problem with drainage, of course, what do you do with the water? We do not have a drain to drain the salts out. What is usually used are holding ponds or evaporation ponds. There's over 7,000 acres of evaporation ponds in the Tulare Lake Basin. What it is a sacrifice. You sacrifice some of your land, you drain water in, let it evaporate. They are quite toxic. It kind of makes Kesterson look like a mild toxicity compared to some of these evaporation ponds. But what do? Maybe there's an answer to that. Part of the problem, of course, is that old lake I alluded to in the beginning of this talk, Lake Corcoran, put down a big clay, it's called the Corcoran clay, underlying the western part of the valley, and it prohibits the percolation of the water, and also the groundwater table is fairly high, especially when you're irrigating it with liberal applications of irrigation water. And of course what you're doing is bringing that saline water up, threatening waterlogging and also capillarity action of salts being raised back to the surface. It's something that they're continually fighting, but this is a legacy of several 100,000 years ago, of course, that's still haunting people. Kind of a famous photo of subsidence due to groundwater withdrawal. To be truthful, this was not in the Tulare Lake Basin. It's about 15 miles north where this, in Fresno County, where this was taken. This is an example of evaporation pond right next to Highway 41 as you go from Kettleman City after you stop for the obligatory bathroom and Coke and head towards Lemoore. You'll see it right next to it. The environment, the social conditions of the towns around. I just bring this up because I just think it's very, very incongruous. You have some of the richest land on earth and some of the poorest people in America living in some of those settlements. This is, I consider, one of the problems. This I consider one of the problems with coping with this environment. You can still see vestiges of what the lake was if you look. Some tules, some bulrushes, but of course in the context of what? An artificial canal. Where the Tule River used to come into the lake, I found some willows and the Tule. Of course, the vegetation in this environment is mainly exotic today. And you have some cultural features that still exhibit or hark back to a time when this was literally on the shoreline. I like this. This is cute. Lakeview. You do find this legacy, and of course it's very, very important to me because I have to visualize these things, but I just sat here and I was astounded of the areas that I was looking at. Oops. This thing went berserk. Now, of course, what's missing is the evidence of what went on before. That long, thousands of year relationship with the lake, that unique assemblage of biological assemblage and also the human occupiers. You know, very little evidence of those pioneers that tried to utilize the lake waters and tried to control the lake waters. This is an old 1892 map showing people buying up the lake shores with the confidence that they will prevail, and they did. The great dredgers that were at work doing this. Earlier episodes of farming, I like this because the clouds. The importance of labor that used to work those fields, where is their legacy on the landscape? We should honor them as well as those guys that were buying the land and reclaiming it. The social disruptions, this happened to be one in the 1930s in Corcoran, you know, a farm strike. Some of those early homesteaders that came out when the lake was seen to be another frontier opened up by reclamation as late as the 1880s and 1890s and in the early part of the 20th century, but they couldn't handle the taxes, the expense of water, the social disruptions, the fluctuation in prices. The great grain era, no longer there. The lakelanders themselves knew the lakeshore intimately, had its own geography. Recreationists that were dyslexic. People that I knew that told me about the shoreline. That's no longer there. But people that are still alive that could talk about the shoreline, and for some reason it just stimulated my imagination. Attempts to settle the lake, trying to find vestiges of it. This was an attempt by a Mexican family. This adobe's no longer there. Again, on the shallow part of the lakes, it's almost impossible to find any evidence of the Yokuts. Their culture was a Thule culture. Appreciation and evidence of that culture that lived here and accommodated with this area. They did affect it, but they were shaped by it, most importantly. In other words, they just rearranged some of the elements, but they were shaped by this lake. The natural, without human beings, the natural diversity, the fecundity of this area, gone are the elk, gone are the, coots and the ducks and the geese, the noise of the bullfrogs. Can it be this again? Should it be this again? I don't want to lose sight. This area is tremendously productive. I've worked for one of the growers out there. It's one of the best experiences of my life, although a sad one too, because what I knew about that region. The choices are ours. It can be this way. And I'd appreciate you telling me what you think. Thank you very much.
I would suggest that one of the new things that's happening in the influence of world markets on the crop prices, commodity prices, is when you look across the cotton and the other safflower that's being grown there. So now you have growers who are saying, going to Fish and Wildlife Service and other places and saying, give me some grant money and I'll build you some habitat. So that's a new element.
It is.
Another element, though, there's that kind of environmental element. There's the element of people recognizing it's a kind of a switching yard between the west side of the valley and the east side of the valley, and the urban districts who want to store water on the fans in the east side, and just with the water recharge. I mean, there's discussion now of moving water back and forth across the Tulare Lake basin using canals that run both ways. The water can literally run both directions if it's fast and it's that flat. But I mean, there's all kinds of schemes that are going on. I appreciate you mentioning the West Coast Farm.
And we had, on top of that, some attempts to sell water outside the basin. Market the water.
Right, well, that's going on. And then the LA County Sanitation District wants to dump for sludge there too.
Whoopee. Yeah.
So it's going to be an area of a lot of intense activity, I think, with some major players, and it's going on right now. And I think that we do have an opportunity, I think, that it's going to get rearranged again.
I think so. In fact, I think we have got a lot of leverage points available. Pending a review. I agree with you, there's a lot going on. North of there in the Westlands Water District, we're buying back land that's highly saline sodic at the going price, 4,000 to 7,000 an acre. And the idea is quit irrigating it, plant some grass over the groundwater table, turn it into some sort of public use. It's happening, as you mentioned. Yes.
Is there any evidence that the Native Americans may have to change the property at all, way of building up some areas a little higher or picking out any area?
Only scant. It's intriguing, and we're not sure. In the 1850s, people on boats in the shallow part of the lake said that they saw Indian gardens with berms around them. Some people studying early irrigation along the Kings River think that irrigation preceded the whites. They came in there preceded 1850. Some of this, though, may be a consequence of refugees, indigenous refugees bringing Spanish, cultural baggage from the Spanish. Other than that, outside the Tulare Lake area, they leveled some ball fields with very, very little As geomorphic agencies, very little that I know of.
Some of the agribusinesses being forced to close down their evaporation ponds, isn't that happening now because of the toxicity of the water?
They're supposed to not.
It's not happening.
The last assessment.
It's not down to 5,000 acres.
What?
I think it's down to 5,000 acres.
Is it now?
It's still, it's an issue though, but they haven't been, there's still a lot of toxic ponds.
I didn't know that. And they're doing some interesting thing. Boswell Company is putting a shrimp in there, brine shrimp. And it's quite exciting, and they're working. I mean, there are some mitigation efforts that seem to be helping. I didn't know about the reduction of some of them. You know, initially they thought for every evaporation, for every acre of evaporation pond, you need an acre of aquatic habitat to match it.
Mitigation.
Yeah, we came up with a 10-to-1 ratio instead of 1-to-1.
You mentioned your dissertation, but I don't think the publicity had, and some people like to know that you published a book with a very full account of this history and many of the maps and graphics you showed us today, so you might want to plug your book. It's probably not a credit. It's still at the libraries.
My dad uses it as a doorstop. We'll talk about lake miners. Now I have to divulge. I mined my dissertation for this talk. All right. Yeah. Thanks for that, Floyd.
And the title, I can't remember. You might want to mention that.
What?
The title of your book, I can't remember, but you might want to mention it.
My memory is vanished. It's called Vanishing Landscapes.
A big force for conservation is ecotourism by affluent people who live in cities. And this works for the Galapagos Islands and it works for Yosemite. Do you foresee that working for the Tulare Basin?
It's a great moonscape. And it is for wildlife. You bring back some waterfowl, I think it could do, but it's the strangest place to be.
It could work, but I think it would resolve to issues of wildlife, just in my sense of what draws people. For instance, down near in Kern County, there's this elk reserve, you know, which draws a few people to it, if you could, but they're fenced in. And if you could put them in a habitat with some other things, that might help. You know that California Gold program, Buellhauser, he called me. He said, let's do a California 15-minute segment on it. He said, great. He called me back. He says, I went there. Huh? I think he still might, but you know, it was really telling because
He did
something, right?
he finally did. He finally got back around to it. But I know he was going to have me go out there. He said, "You sure wear boots?"
This is just an astonishing story. I was raised in California, went to high school and college, and I had no idea this legend existed. Actually, until I read the book, which is a great book, I recommend it to you. And ever since I read the book, it always has fascinated me that there are 30,000 cars a day that drive by Kettleman City on I-5. And it's amazing that there's no marker. There's nothing there that tells you to look to the east and see what was, a million years ago, this lake.
It's just this remarkable antithesis. It looks pretty uniform. I mean, albeit economic production and all that kind of stuff, but one of the most diverse, biologically diverse environments around. There are more yokets, as an example, living around the edge of the lake than there are people living around it now, even in those towns. And why not a marker?
Yeah.
Or an interpretive center? But you know, you stop at Kettleman City and get that Coke and you look out there. Yeah. But maybe if you knew what to look for and you could stimulate your imaginations, I'd like to see it.
Can we start a movement right here today?
Embarrassingly, I've never thought about that, but I've taken students there and annoyed them.
I want to make a comment on what you said. I think one of the problems that we have seems to be when writing about California's water is that we emphasize more on the political battles for the water. And we seldom educate our children and young people about the waterscape itself and the associated life, just for the sake of enjoying the. If we were to do that, then when we drive by, we will look out of the window and then try to understand. Yesterday, it turns out I was returning from Los Angeles. I stopped at Gentleman City, but I told my wife that here used to be a lake.
But you went, yeah.
I have a question for you. Originally, when we wanted to rid the place of pestilence, we reclaimed the place. Now when we want to put back the lake, what do we call it?
What do we call it?
Restoration.
Is it really, we already reclaimed something from that?
Really reclaiming it now.
We are really reclaiming it. Now, the reclamation word itself was contrary to meaning.
Yeah, well, you're right.
Yeah.
Reclaiming what? It was,
Where is the Westlake proposal at this point, do you know? Or how would you find out more about that?
don't call Westlake Farms. For some reason, last year I went to talk to them. One of the head guys there. You know, it's just a couple miles north of Kettleman City, their headquarters. He was kind of keeping it close to his vest. But I think Department of, what's it, Water,
DWR, talking to DWR, they've been in negotiations with Westlake for many years. They broke it off for a while, and then now they resurrected it because DWR wants to dump their floodwater there instead of putting the state aquifer for one place to dump their red Pasaharo water. So
How do you know so much?
my name's Peter Borst, I'm a hydrologist at the Institute. But there's proposals that have been put forth by people to also make storage reservoirs there to temporarily park water, both the floodwaters coming from the east side and the floodwaters coming from the west side, as a way of to move water around, both for consumptive uses and for environmental restoration. Phase 2 wants to restore the San Joaquin River flows, and as part of the proposal to create water supply for the San Joaquin River, we're looking at, we propose the concept of storage into layered lake basin. I can go in more detail afterwards, but it's, and other people are looking at that for groundwater recharge. No, on the lake bottom itself, the soils are too tight for recharge, but because of, kind of indirect recharge as well as just, if there's adjoining districts, we can do trades and whatnot that indirectly raise the groundwater level.
What's your sense for the public knowing about these things? In other words, when you say that we have some, or I mentioned the word leverage, things are happening, we might be able to,
It's
for the public to engage, to try to nudge it in one direction or another.
Yeah. It's back rooms, very much back room, and I think it does take
Well,
talks like this.
the leverage is that there's a number of projects that are proposed, all which have different purposes. Some of them are for water storage, some of them for water quality improvement, et cetera. All of them will require some form of environmental documentation, which means that there will be ability for citizens groups, other affected parties, et cetera, to comment, litigate, organize, et cetera. So there may be some opportunities to try and add the kind of benefits that you were referring to any of those projects as they move forward. But very few people will be aware of them because it's not really anybody's backyard.
There's leverage through the bond money that's being, a lot of these growers and a lot of these proposals want to use state bond money. In fact, they have already received state bond money to do some storage reservoirs there, and they'll probably be applying for Prop 50 money, and they've been applying for they've received Prop 13 money. So those programs were publicly out, some input into how that money was spent. I mean, again, it's somewhat esoteric, but that's another leverage point.
Here's a question.
Yeah, I do a lot of research regarding this whole idea of the public trust. in water. And I'm just really curious, in taking a look at this history, how would you go about taking a look at what the public interest is in this landscape and its hydrology? Because it's to some extent, you know, obviously it's a story, but you know, the names, you didn't say who the names were of these people who were buying out these townships and who they are now. And I think it's a fantastic. So did you get any sense of how to go about finding out what the public interest might be in this lake?
Land tenure. I don't like taking this approach, but a lot of fraud.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of fraud. You know, the old stories about swamp and overflow and not fulfilling the various land alienation acts. A lot of backroom things. This is kind of political. I don't believe this works, and you can talk about this stuff until you turn blue. But that is a public trust because it meant public betrayal in some ways. And maybe that should be mitigated. In other words, I mean, you might be able to use that. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult, you know, to talk about, especially in this climate, about the common good. It is private land, after all.
But they get public money for flood control. Can you comment on that? When it does flood, Congress, in its wisdom, says to Bob or Sally, you can use public money for that.
That's one question over there. You have a question? Maybe you have a question?
I'd like to say, I've got to say that I think it's really something to think about. And my thinking has been in this other direction, look at the legalities. You know, water subsidies, crop subsidies, you know, we're all stakeholders in this. Some of the fraud and land alienation, but I'm just real pessimistic about how, if that can really help change things, I'd like to try to find another avenue of what that public trust is and how to communicate it. I don't have an answer beyond that.
One final.
I have a question, yeah.
Final question.
As far as hydrological restoration, if that's a possibility, you talked about some of the biotic species that went extinct in this whole saga. Do you think that there's any hope for actual ecological restoration of parts of Tulare Lake? I mean, are there documented botanical extinctions or the flora and the fauna, can they actually be restored to any kind of significant state?
It goes against my nature to be optimistic, but yes, there are. When I visited Westlake Farms, the sections that they tried to turn back,
Yeah.
I was really impressed.
Just a little water on there. One time I was out there, you see little pieces of water in waterfowl. It's amazing.
Waterfowl and most of the vegetation is still around somewhere. You know, it may be extant in this one area, but it's around somewhere and could be reintroduced. So, again, it goes against my propensities, but I'm hopeful.
One last question.
Tulare Lake is the largest, but not the only ephemeral lake in the southern end there. Have you or anybody else looked at the environmental and cultural history of the other lakes?
Kerr Lake, Buena Vista Lake, Goose Lake. A little bit, I'm pretty close to the archaeologist at Bakersfield. And I've been on their digs at Goose Lake and written a little bit about it. But the only thing I can share is any kind of highland out there has archaeological humus on it. In other words, these areas were densely populated. It's impossible to really kind of relate the kind of demography that's there because of lack of evidence, but there's people interested in it, but I don't think there's been an evolutionary story written about that southern end of the valley, Kern County. I'd like to do it in another life. Just so I don't have to live at home again.